Hello. So this is the first walkthrough of the first part of the Bowling Game Kata, which I've ported to Visual Studio 2019 using C#. All of the code and everything you'll need, or really the instructions of how to follow all of this, are all on my GitHub page. Yes, I know it's not really called that. Um, and I think rather than go on too much about all of this, I'll just get started and then we can explore it as we go along. So the very first thing you've got to do is you start from this blank Visual Studio. So nothing going on, no solution, nothing open, and always start from this. So don't, unless you want to pause the kata halfway through, or it's taking a long time and you've got something else to do, or the phone rings or whatever, then you might not start from the beginning. But the actual beginning of the kata is this blank Visual Studio. So if you're running it all the way through from end to end, which hopefully you'll end up doing quite a lot, this is where you start. And you start with Shift, Control, and New, or N. And what we want is a blank solution. So what you'll notice I just did there is touch the mouse, and I've just done it again. Generally speaking, the idea is to not touch the mouse unless you really, really have to. Unfortunately, when you're setting all the solutions up at the beginning, then you kind of have to quite a lot. But you want to get to the point where you don't touch the mouse as quickly as you can. So let's try and do that. I'm going to call it Bowling Game Kata. And then create that. I'm just going to use the default location, which fortunately isn't called anything too stupid. And like I say, I will delete it as soon as I'm done and I'll start it again next time. So there's my blank solution. So now I want to add the projects to it, and it's the same kind of deal. I'm going to search for, I could have done Alt and S then without touching the mouse, couldn't I? It told me that. Anyway, I'll try that next time. What are we doing? We're doing a NUnit test project in C#. I want one of them. And at time of writing, I'm going to call it BowlingGame.tests.unit. I'm also going to sit up because that might make me type better. I'm not promising anything, but I'll give it a go. And then I want to add it to the solution. There we go. And now it's going to go, which version of .NET? Let's go for .NET 3. Core 3.1 long-term support, which in Microsoft's terminology means 3 to 6 months, probably. Who knows? I could be being very rude. Let's create that. Let it have a little spin and a think for a second. Oh, blimey. Yeah, there it goes. And now I want to do the same thing again. So it's Control, Shift, and N for a new one. Now let's try doing Alt and S. Oh, search, and I want a class application, a class library. Class library, there we go. Is it just going to do that for me? Let's do that, and let's call it, I'm doing Bowling Game. And I'm trying to do this, I'm going to try and get away with, yeah, there we go, without using the mouse. Oh, look at that. Brilliant. And I just want to create that. There we go. So I managed to do loads of it there without using the mouse. I'm quite pleased with myself. The reason for not using the mouse is because you want to do this as quickly as you can. So every time you take your hands off the keyboard to touch the mouse, that slows you down. And the whole idea of a kata, well, we'll go into that in a sec, but a little bit more tidying up to do. I want to create a dependency between the two. So I want to add a project reference. There's probably a keyboard shortcut for that, but I don't know it. So if you do know it, keep it to yourself. Have fun. Okay. And then before I go much further, let's just make the text a bit bigger so people can see what's going on as well. There we go. Okay. So before I get into the actual coding, just a quick word on what a kata actually is. So kata is a Japanese word, I believe, which I think comes from martial arts. Now, I'm not a martial arts expert because I prefer to bore people to death if I can. But the idea of a kata is, well, the most famous kata of all time is from Karate Kid, where he does the wax on, wax off, paint the fence. that's kind of kata style stuff, because the idea of that was to try and get muscle memory into your body, so that then when somebody tries to lamp you, you've got all the blocking moves in place without having to think. So that's what the point of this kata is as well. You're trying to learn a couple of things in particular. The main one is red-green refactor test-driven coding. So all of this is done with writing a failing test, getting it passing, and then trying to keep everything in the green as much as possible. That may not make much sense depending how into all this you are, but hopefully you'll learn it from doing this. The other thing this particular port of the kata does is it should get the shortcuts and use of Visual Studio kind of into more of a habit, and that's the key word, is habit. The idea is that you're trying to get a kind of habits to form so that you start to do test driven development and test first coding without thinking about it. It just becomes second nature. I've seen people over the years who've actually looked at this kata and they've started trying to use it more as a kind of code review exercise, like how can we refactor this to make it a much more elegant approach to the requirements of a bowling game scoring system. Yeah, unless you're actually in the market of producing game scoring systems, waste of time. You're kind of missing the point. The idea is to follow the exercise in the same way that Ralph Macchio was waxing on and waxing off and painting the fence. And then the full idea will be to try and speed run this. So there's a whole kind of concept in gaming called speed running, where you just try and play the whole of Mario from end to end in 3 minutes. So I think it ought to be possible to do this kata in less than 5 minutes from end to end. I'm going to take quite a bit longer to do that, mainly because I'm yakking on at you. So let's carry on. So, okay, we've got 2 projects and some classes or some files that actually aren't quite set up how we want them to be. So the first thing to do is to rename stuff. I think I could probably, I've told you to use the mouse. So there we go, not to use the mouse. F2, I can rename it. I want to call this Bowling Game Tests. And I want to change the name of the class to Bowling Game Tests. Sometimes Visual Studio does that for you, sometimes it doesn't. That time it didn't. And so that's our first test setup. So now here's a repeating thing that you can do all the way through. Now I've got my my test explorer open over here, but now it's open like that. I try and stop touching the mouse. You can constantly rerun the tests by doing Control and R, take the fingers off the keyboard, click A, or press A, and that will rerun your tests. That's like the most commonly reused keyboard shortcut of the whole thing. And lo and behold, as I just have a test that's test 1 that passes, my tests are all green. I'm going to change this name to Test Gutter Game. So a little bit of bowling. I'm obviously an expert in 10-pin bowling. So, I feel ashamed at having to explain this to you. Actually, I've been about 4 times in my whole life. But one thing that I did consistently is roll the ball down the gutter at the side and knock no pins down. So that's the idea of a gutter game. It's 20 rolls of the ball without ever hitting anything. So the score should be 0. And that's like the easiest test to pass. We're doing this test first. So that's the first test. 20 rolls of 0, no score. So in order to start that, what I need to do is to actually create a game class that's going to manage the game scoring for me. So I'm going to do this here. Nope. I love it when Visual Studio does that. Equals new game. So obviously, for those of you that do a bit of coding, there isn't a game, hence the red squiggly line. There's no game yet, but what you can do, Control and full stop for the English among you, period for the Americans among you, which means something completely different in English. That brings up the refactoring menu, and I can do generate a new type from there. So let's do that. And I want to call it game.cs. And I want to do it in the Bowling Game project. And I want to create a new file. Oh, I think I screwed that up. I did, didn't I? Well, I'll tell you what then. I'm just going to rename this. The kata goes a bit differently from that. So that should just be called game. Be gone. There we go. Ignore that bit. You'll be able to do that much more smoothly yourselves. Okay, back to this. Okay, so what do you do in a game of bowling? Well, you roll the ball. So let's do a game.roll. So that's our first method. And of course, I'm going to roll 0 because I'm rolling it down the gutter. But there's no roll. So control and full stop again. And you want to generate a method called roll. But I want to roll it 20 times as well. So this needs to be in a loop. So select it and then Control S and then surround with 4. And let's make length 20. There we go. And then finally, I've done my 20 rolls of 0. So I should get an overall score of 0. Game.score. Now, of course, it doesn't have a score either. So we're going to have the same thing. So let's do a score property. Generate property game.score. So back in my game class, I now have constructor. I don't really need that. I'm going to get rid of that for the time being. And some score and a roll. But if I run my tests, and you'll see why on the screen there, I should get big red. No, broken. That's because if I actually look at the test result, well, it's there. Look, system not implemented exception, and that's thrown you up not implemented exception. So this is the default code that the refactoring tool generates when you create a method. Get Visual Studio to write it for you. Now, here's a trick. I'm going to get rid of that. Oops. I'm just going to leave it like that. And Control RA again. And oh, look, it passes. Now, the reason it passes, I've got a little bit of tidying up to do here as well. I need to change that to pins because that's a more meaningful parameter name. It's the number of pins that you have knocked over with your roll. In fact, number of pins would be more meaningful, really, but we'll leave it as pins for the time being. So the reason this passes is because the default value for an integer in there we go. For an integer in .NET is 0. So remember, my test is just testing that 20 rolls of 0 gives me 0, and game.score has to equal 0. So there we go, 0's all round. That test passes. Obviously, we're pretty far away from there being a kind of working bowling game piece of code here, but we've got the first test passing. And in order to do that, we have done quite a lot of little gnarly setup bits like creating the two projects and putting the dependency in between them, etc., etc., etc. So this is a good kind of first test. And of course, if we do anything to stop the gutter game from being 0, then this test will tell us in future as well. So it's a valid test and it stays in the code. So that's the first walkthrough. There's going to be another one along in a minute where we go through the second part of this. There's 5 different commits in total. I'm not doing the commit part because I don't have a repository set up for this. But generally speaking, if you wanted to do it properly justice, then you'd create a little Git repository and commit at the end of every stage, because that's good practice. Commits should be few, little and often rather, and kind of sensible parts. So we've got the first test passing. That's a great time for a commit. And if you go to my GitHub, you will find that I've structured it all around commits. Okay, that's enough waffling for this one. So let me stop this and then we'll move on to the next one.